Some interesting provocations in Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn, the Austrian philosopher, who strikes me as he's probably roughly contemporary of Strauss, but I haven't looked at the dates actually. But just some spontaneous thoughts on listening to one of his lectures. But of course, the Strauss is from Prussia. And, here we're talking about Austrian view. Musil, I think, is very eye-opening on this situation in Austria when the technological essence was coming to hold sway, and people consciously coming to hold sway. Although he presents it as though it's sort of interesting. He casts the consciousness of the moment when it's coming to hold, when the awareness is really coming clear to some avant-garde writers of this issue, but he casts it back into the eve of World War One. But yeah, that's interesting to look at from the point of view of change in mentality, or change in bios theory, or the way at first just a few people change their quality, and then the way the mass of society sort of changes its efficacious actions, which sort of follow the vision of that telos or quality. So one of the arguments he makes is a theological argument, which is that one makes a ranking in terms of quality between Judas Iscariot and the apostle Peter, for instance, so that it would seem that they're not exactly the same in the eyes of God. So I'll give a proof of how strong this type of mentality is. So my spiritual advisor admits, and he grants that in a certain sense, like for instance, like myself, he thinks Netanyahu is evil. So, but he thinks possibly Netanyahu will be not just go to hell, but he'll be completely erased, even from the Akashic. How do you say that? The Akashic, even from the Akashic records, even from anything. So that's an indication that somehow. Now, what power accomplishes that? So that's why I say Dasein is more like at the rank of a demiurge, or Odin, or some kind of creator god. It's not. If we say, where does this decision come from to treat differently different individuals, and according to their crimes, and according to their how graced they are, or other factors of the like, according to some ranking of the most perfect, or the perfect in the superlative, and the absolute in this Thomistic sense, as this absolute lack of good, which isn't positive evil. Yeah, this sort of view, yeah, that's difficult. So, I mean, I guess if I haven't probed him about that, so maybe he'd be in agreement with the fact it's difficult, because if we say the I am is genuinely what it says it is, the being, and therefore of this very answer to Moses, who sent you. And sorry. I think the way I like to state it myself is, when there's the question of the thing that Zizek lies about, for instance, it fits is if there's Job is saying to Yahweh, saying, but why have you, something about the problem of decay or of divine justice. How do they call that? Sometimes they call it problem of evil. But why are you allowing evil? And then Yahweh answers, before you were, I am. And I don't think that actually occurs in the book of Job, but I'm just presenting it that way. And then it's sort of like, you don't know all the problems. You don't get it. But I've seen all the difficulties. It's a sensible argument, I think. I think actually in the book of Job, it's more like you weren't there when I was creating the earth, which is very different than you weren't than before you were I am. But it's sort of it's a more extreme version in a way. You lived your pitiful short span of life. What insight do you have? I was there when the creating was happening. I know what the difficulties were. It's like that. To put it in crude terms, it's like the argument that Darwin made about the dog intuiting the mind of Newton. So it's like that's an intelligible argument. So Zizek just lies and pretends there's no intelligible argument in the book of Job. Though I think that he knows that. He's just because it just fits it's just an amusing way to fit his overall tag. So this question is all really about the question of quality. So that's what I'm getting at. So this Austrian philosopher is bringing out that originally, at the time of the founding, in America, neither the founding statement nor the Constitution mentions democracy, and it only mentions Republican form of government once, with respect to saying you can't have Regina Imperatrix, Kristen Stewart of California, or something like that. You can't suddenly produce an empire out of what was supposed to be a state that was a co-equal member of the Federation. In a way, that's what it's prohibiting, but it's very elusive, right? So all of the things around the founding are very elusive. They're open, and they only point to one so-called quote-unquote oracle, Montesquieu, and his system, which is meant to prevent the cyclical breakdown, as according to the ancient Greeks, of the regime types into having to suffer these constant collapses and revivifications of the country. So that argument says democracy only comes in historically at a certain time, right? And then there's this sense that, so if we have this big subjectivity versus objectivity argument, it's like somehow historically, for random reasons, democracy became to be said to be, it wasn't people that were deliberating and deliberately founded the country on those principles, but somehow either through the struggle between the jurists and when they're making laws, or through the active political struggle, or some way, this became the propaganda everywhere of saying that the democracy is the way to do things, and that so that everybody is, so that, but it shows how little it's really, how deep it is that remember when Trump won in the Trump 45, and then, but he lost by like 3 million votes or something like that, and then only through this outlier sort of miracle of the Electoral College did he win. But then when people were kind of anxious about that, but the answer was always, well, that's not the way we do it, of course. And then some people tried to lie and say, oh, well, Trump knew that, and that's why he was campaigning here or there. It's true that Hillary did know it because she was in the Rust Belt states at the last moment and hour. But in fact, I think Trump thought he was going to lose, in my opinion. But because it was such an outlier thing, and nobody had really calculated that it had never happened anything close to that magnitude. That there was, I think it was 3 million votes, wasn't it? It was huge. So I mean, we'd had the Gore Bush thing, but it was based. That was based on in fact, that was based on just a few votes, I think. A very small number, plausibly. And I guess when it ended, it was like, I guess settling it was based on just a few votes, but the actual count was was it 500,000 maybe? At most it was 500,000, probably less, I think. But yeah, so the principle of the rule by numbers, then we could say, according to this, what this guy points out is this quantity quality comes in. So that kind of links up with Rene Guénon to some extent. I think it writes, I think this is one of his themes, the rule of quantity. But we could see that it's exactly against quality, which is sometimes presented as aristocracy, and then immediately sort of it seems to be discredited because we think of some kind of parasitical aristocrats in the sense of the old regime, in the sense of not just the naivete implied by the probably false saying about Marie Antoinette, but also of a more something that had once been the head of a warrior state becoming sort of bourgeois, almost bourgeois, just living for comfort. And then you think that's not really an aristocrat. But then I think they have, so probably you could say, and I think his contemporaries did say of Lord Curzon, who was one of the governors of India under the Raj, I'm a very superior man, something like that, which was of course meant somewhat ironically, but nonetheless there was a respect for Etonians and for the public school ethos, as it were, that was instilled into a relatively small cadre of the British. There was something behind it, right? Just like I think they're the same reason that the Wehrmacht or the Germans in general seem to, you can't help but admit that there's something still left of the old Prussian culture that survived through that war-torn generation of World War I into the so-called dread of Walpurgis, as it were, the Krauss calls it, Walpurgis Nacht. But so yeah, you could see the question of quality in the sense, and I think I see it. To me, I see it in the Kurosawa films. Although Kurosawa is said to be Western, and film itself is said to bastardize and westernize what Japan was before film existed, make it more into the possession of the global system. But you see, a physical culture and a seriousness of a different kind, which is associated with sort of this seeking out the Aristos quality or the best quality, and then trying to see which people in the society could meet that standard. So, like this, we should remember that this move into the insistence on quantity is the same as this thing that sounds so great, the move into democracy, that we've received this value, as it were, randomly. So that's the point. So that's the point Strauss is always making. He said there's a division between the empirical sciences that tell you how something happens and the question about why. But these whys, or these values, some of them come down to us historically like this. So we wake up and find out that we're supposed to praise democracy, and that it's supposed to be good somehow. And it's greatly fostered by the fact that one is immediately understood when one talks that way, or in some similar way. And it's lingua franca, or das man Sprache, and Sprach, or so that the values become also susceptible of scientific study. And say, how did it happen that the Americans came to have these curious beliefs, and to insist on them passionately, and then you could study it. You could study that empirically. What are the events that happened, and what are the historical sources? And it becomes a how question. And so that's what history is. So all history in that sense is sort of, this is the sense in which all history today is Marxist history, because it all assumes the kind of, that it's more important to look at how it happened in the sense of thinking that the how tells you kind of the cause, so you could kind of gauge what to do in the future based on causal science. And that's how all history has become Marxist history in this sense, even amongst those historians that hate Marx. So this reception so that's what we get asked. Is it forced that because everyone in the country is talking about democracy in a positive way, and that shows in the fact that the Trumpers showed side relief when Trump 47 actually, at least in the outright version, got higher numbers, won the election by numbers. Why is it important? Maybe it is, but we're told it's important to have the quantity rather than the quality. Told that the greater number isn't worth more than the weight of the judgment. Maybe there's no judgment at all involved. That's part of the point. Because one is supposed to have the right to be irrational, and therefore to cast one's vote any way one wants. It doesn't have to be an informed judgment. That's just an admonition of propagandists of the vote. But there's nothing about voting that says you have to have considered these things in a serious way. Now, you could vote any way you want. It's your vote. It's irrational. It's arbitrary. It's under your power. I think those are questions one can ask oneself, and at the same time it shows in some way phenomenologically what Das Man means in Heidegger, I think, and what therefore the Eigenlich, or the sort of taking hold of one's self and saying, just because this is the lingua franca, just because everything on X and everything on the main media channels, which is immediately intelligible, talks this way, it doesn't mean one has to accept the force of those immediately acknowledged logos, as it were. So you could have this Noomakhia, I think, that Dugin speaks of.